Revenge hide there. No one wants to suffer, and it's natural to want to avoid pain and discomfort. Yet, if you're seeking to grow, normalizing suffering will facilitate the growth process in your personal development. Let's start by understanding how suffering actually helps with growth. Although it presents a negative experience, we recognize that it's part of life, especially the growth part of life. No one grows to maturity who doesn't understand what it means to endure pain. So, when we think about pain, what is one of the worst types that comes to mind? In many cases, it includes a painful experience that is inflicted upon us by someone else. We already bring a great deal of pain to our lives by our own transgressions, and at the same time, others can inflict just as much injury on us. It adds salt to our wounds. We have natural responses to being hurt that are part of our imperfections. We do not always respond well to stresses in our lives. These responses come easily to us, but they are not helpful to our personal growth. Next time someone hurts you, try using these tools. Acknowledge the wound. Don't deny it. When we are hurt emotionally, we tend to deny it. For example, an unloving wife may wound a husband's heart, but he may not want to appear weak or vulnerable, or he may think he is being overly sensitive, or he may think that admitting his hurt is being disloyal or mean to his wife, so he shrugs off the wound. However, he is living a lie. Just saying something doesn't hurt us doesn't make it go away, and the wounded heart stays injured. Stay connected. Don't isolate. We tend to withdraw from relationship when we hurt. Some people are afraid of their dependencies on others. Others feel guilty about burdening friends with their problems. Still others try to be self-sufficient. None of these responses helps a person heal and grow. Love and forgive. Don't retaliate. People also naturally lash back when they are hurt, and they desire revenge on the one who hurt them. Like little kids, they will harbor murderous intentions and attempt to retaliate. For example, a woman who has been betrayed by a man she is dating may then do the same to him. Perhaps they had agreed to an exclusive relationship, deepening their commitment and trust. Then she found out he was seeing someone else. The problem with rationalizing retaliation is that while he certainly needs to know how he hurts others, it's more likely to help him justify his own behavior. Practice self-control. Don't be controlled. Our initial response to being hurt is that we lose self-control. Our getting hurt in a relationship is proof of how little control we have over others in the first place. Many times we transfer power onto the person who has hurt us, which makes things worse. For example, a man may realize his parents have been emotionally unresponsive to him all his life. He may see how this unresponsiveness has made his relational life difficult, as he has not been connected enough to his inner self to connect to others. As he understands this, he may then also become obsessed with trying to get his parents to see what they did to him or get them to apologize, or get them to reparent him and provide him for what they did not when he was a child. Good relationships do involve confronting, forgiving and reconciling. However, some people make the injured self the focus of their lives, letting the other person control them. In this way, they put their hearts under the power of the very ones who injured them. That's not a productive way to live. If you're working on your personal growth and development, practice self-control as you work on injuries by others. While you need to confess and process pain, you'll also need to take back ownership of your life. One of the most important tasks you'll have is to repair those injuries. You may need to receive emotional warmth from others, or learn how to be separate. Other times, you may need to learn how to give up self-critical and perfectionistic ways. These are all forms of self-control rather than controlled by the hurts of others. Let's get started. Cheers. Henry IPS. In case you haven't noticed, we're getting pretty close to the end of this path. I hope you're feeling filled up with what you're learning.
Hey guys, I might frustrate you here a little bit because I'm going to be talking about something that we all feel kind of innately, and that's the need to get revenge. If somebody's hurt you, if somebody's wronged you, if you're an innocent victim, it is a natural cry of our heart to want to kind of hurt back, right? I mean, you see kids do this. You hit me and I'll hit you, and basically that's it's called the talionic law, the law of the talon. It's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and there's a part of that you've got a lot of justice and a bunch of other stuff. It's really complicated. It's certain, you know, in justice that somebody's got to pay for something, right? That's what justice is. But here's the problem in personal offenses. Okay, now it doesn't. If somebody's stolen something from you, justice is to have that remedied, and there's great remedies to do that. But what I'm talking about is when we want to inflict pain on somebody in some way to bring them down, not for justice, but basically for our own gratification of you got me, I'm going to get you. And it's that satisfaction in someone else's suffering that they're going to suffer like I did. Now, there's a lot of problems with that. The biggest one is, don't you have better things to do? Now, here's what I mean. Let's say somebody offends you. Let's say it's in your social circle, and you're gonna get revenge. You're gonna do something to them. You're gonna orchestrate some divisiveness, or you're gonna humiliate them, or you're gonna make them feel bad. Okay, from whatever point this is, up until that's served in you, which by the way is not the end of your problems. We'll get to that. But from then until there, you're on a mission, and your life is not getting any better. You haven't done one thing to improve your life. That's why there's an old, and I think it's a Spanish saying, but I'm not sure. But it says something like this: the best revenge is to have a good life. See, if somebody hurts you or you're victimized or whatever it is, to not let that overcome you and to ruin you, and you're going to go create a great life, then you've moved down the road and you're thriving, and they're still stuck in the misery of who they are as being a destructive, hurtful person, which is never gratifying, even though it looks like they might have moments of everything's going, great, but they're still that destructive person. You, on the other hand, have unhinged yourself from that person, and you've gone on down the road. I remember a friend of mine's parents, when I was in high school, they got divorced, and he really, he caused it. I mean, he was unfaithful, and he left her for another woman. Okay, I hadn't seen that family in a long time, and it's like probably 30 years later at a reunion, I saw them, and I knew both parents, and I said, "So what are your parents up to now?" Because I liked both of them. One of them had gone on and lived his life. The mother was still so full of hatred and trying to get at him and bring it and bitterness and stuck and still victimized in this revenge and need for revenge. And part of the revenge was wanting the kids to side with her and trash his name and all this kind of stuff. She couldn't get out of that loop. At this point, she was like 70 years old and was stuck in the time warp of still wanting revenge of what he had done to her. Now, think, what if, remember I said somebody's got to pay? The opposite, in one way of looking at this, the opposite of revenge is forgiveness. You've heard this before. Forgiveness is not only granting somebody else, the freedom to start anew and reconcile with you if they own it and say, I'm sorry, and come back. But if they don't, the fact that you have let them go, forgiveness literally means to cancel a debt. And if we write it off and say, you know what, I'm never going to get repayment, which revenge is trying to get repayment in their suffering. have them suffer, now I feel better. That's repayment. So if we say, you know what, I don't need that, somebody's got to pay. Who pays? The forgiver pays. When I forgive somebody and I don't try to go make them suffer, I'm never going to get repaid by them. But I pay by working through the pain and working through the grief, and I do the suffering. You know, in the Christian story, somebody pays for sin. But what Jesus modeled was he will pay so he can forgive, and then there can be a great future for anybody who comes and joins that. But not going to be like held captive to that. And then what he says to us is, forgive others as you have been forgiven. That was the model. Now, I don't think that's only for our forgiveness in terms of, how we've transgressed, but I think it's also the formula for how we get to an abundant life with each other. Because if you're seeking revenge, you're on a mission, and that's taking up your life. I mean, how many movies and TV series and all that do you see? The plot line is about these two people that are pitted against each other, and they're trying to bring each other down, and each one of them just falls into their own destruction because of all the toxic energy that's put into that. Now, if you had forgiven and said, you know what, I'm not going to spend my life worrying about that person anymore, that de facto says I'm not going to seek revenge. I'm going to take the high ground, which means I'm going to go pursue a great life. Now we've gotten rid of that toxicity. You've cut the cancer out and all the power that it has to try to bring you down. And not only that, you stopped poisoning your own circles. Generally, okay, when people seek revenge, it's somebody that's hurt them within the circle that they live in. And when you turn into a toxic revenge seeker, a bitter person within that circle, you're also poisoning the well within the family or the company or wherever it is that you live. And other people are not going to be attracted to a bitter, vengeful person. Plus, they're not going to trust you because they're going to think, well, that's going to turn on me. That's a couple of the benefits, but let me give you a better one. You've got the infection out of your soul. Okay, if you're seeking revenge, you are walking around with toxic hatred that's fueling the cells of your body with toxins, and the cells of your mind, and the cells of your heart, and the cells of your psyche with toxins every single day. I don't want to live in a tent that's got that kind of poison in it. And so that's why to not seek revenge does so many good things for you. You know what? Ultimately, and I think this is, and you see a lot of different people say this a lot of different ways. Karma says this, and other people say, well, whatever you do, the universe is going to find a way to pay you back. There's justice built in, and the just desserts and all that kind of stuff. That people that really, are kind of the ones that are sowing destruction in other people's lives, it's going to come. God and the universe are going to deal with them. Why don't you just go have a nice life and let it go? Now, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying let bad people off the hook for things they ought to be locked up for things they ought to be fined for. That's justice, and they got to pay a fine for that. That's different than seeking their destruction. Revenge is seeking, it's not having somebody pay for something. That's justice. If you steal something from me, I want you to pay me what that costs, okay? That's just good old justice. If you break a law, there's a fine. What I'm talking about is the wish to harm, the wish to hurt, the wish to bring somebody down, the wish to inflict pain upon them. That's different than them paying the consequences of their own pain under the law. That means you've got a destructive impulse living inside. And I just don't know any way to walk around with a bunch of hate and be a healthy, productive, fruitful, loving person. So you got to figure out, who do you want to be? Again, I'm not talking about people getting off the hook, okay? Abusers, all this sort of stuff. Yeah, the Bible says the law is for the lawless, and we call the cops. We call child protective services. We fire people when they do crummy things to a company. You protect yourself from people abusing you, using you, stealing from you, destroying you, all of that. There's evil in the world. We have to protect ourselves, and we have to call them to justice. They have to be held accountable. That's different than seeking revenge. I'll never forget a woman I was working with one time whose husband had treated her badly. And she walked in my office. She was so happy. But in this smile, I could see right underneath it this ugliness. And I said, "So what are you smiling about?" She said, "I just saw his," you could see her smiling. "I just saw his new Mercedes down in the parking lot. And when I walked by it, I keyed it all the way up the side. And it was just, he's just going to be so upset." The pleasure that she took in that revenge was not something I want to be close to. And wherever she goes from there, she's going to carry that into the rest of her life until she resolves it. Call a foul a foul. Call for justice. Call for consequences. Call for people to pay fines. Call for destructive, harmful people to be locked up so they can't hurt anybody else. That's different than seeking someone's downfall. That's what you want to guard yourself against.
Forgiveness. Welcome to the final unit of this path. You did it. I'm so proud of you. You've truly come a long way. I hope you feel some relief and are seeing some real growth in your life. I hope that you've put yourself in a position where you can use what you've learned out in the real world. The last thing we're talking about in this path is forgiveness. And while we've talked about different kinds of letting go previously in this path, this is here to help you tidy up. Forgiveness is one of my favorite topics because it's key to life, but I know it's so difficult because we have to go so deep into it. We don't always see the beauty of forgiveness on the surface, but it's important to understand because to err to be human. Think about it. What's your other option? Every relationship, including those who are on the other side of us, is that we're going to err to each other. We're going to make mistakes, and sometimes they are very painful, and sometimes they are very destructive. If a relationship is going to have a future, what are you going to do with the circumstances? Do we want tomorrow to have the destructiveness of the past in it? Do you want to carry the problem into the future? Let's say you get a splinter in your finger, and it gets infected. Maybe you work with your hands. You're a piano player. How are your performances going to work in the future if that finger is still infected? We can't play life very well if we're walking around holding on to wounds from the past. When we don't forgive, it keeps us chained to the past. I'm excited to dive into this with you and can't wait to hear what you have to say. If you haven't already, I hope you'll join the conversation in my Boundaries Me Facebook group. Thank you so much for pushing through on this journey with me, Henry.
Hey guys, welcome to one of my favorite topics, and that is the topic of forgiveness. Now, forgiveness is one of my favorites for a lot of reasons, but mainly because of its value. I mean, it is a key to life, and it's one of my favorites because it's one that is so difficult that we really have to sometimes go deep into it. And once we begin to go deep into it, we find the value and we find the beauty in it and we find the potential in it. But a lot of times we don't see that on the surface because, again, of how difficult it is. Because, you know, to err is human and to forgive is divine. You've heard that? Well, both of those are true. And the reason forgiveness is so important is because to err is human. Now, think about this. What's your other option? If you're going to have relationships with humans, to err is human. And so every relationship, including people that are on the other side of us in relationships, is we're going to err with each other. We're going to miss it. We're going to make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes are very, very painful. Sometimes they're very, very destructive. But if that relationship is going to have a tomorrow, then the question becomes, what do we do with this pain and destructiveness? And the real question is this: do we want tomorrow to have the destructiveness of the past in it? In other words, do you want to carry the problem into the future? Well, that's what unforgiveness does. It does it in the relationship, but it also does it for me as a person. For example, let's say that I was hurt early in life, which I was. I think a lot of you can identify with that. And let's say that it was so atrocious and horrible that it wounded me deeply. And I can identify with that. And that's true. Well, let's say that I hold on to that and I'm carrying that around. And part of that is holding on to the anger and the vengeance and the judgment and the connection in reality to that person, whether or not I ever see them again or whether or not I have a relationship with them. I'm still connected to them inside of my soul and connected to that abuse or connected to that injury or whatever. And see, what that does is, even if that person is not around, now that infiltrates my system, and I've got this desire for justice that I'm carrying forward into new relationships. And now I'm taking this bias and this hurt, and now because of things like transference, we transfer old injuries onto new people when they haven't done anything. Now we see them in light of the ones that hurt us, for example, or we get angrier at a new offense by somebody because it's the anger of the past, or it's not healed inside of me. Think about this. If you get a splinter in your finger and it gets infected, well, let's say you're a piano player. How are your concerts going to work for the next 20 years if that finger's still infected? See, we can't play life very well if we're walking around holding on to wounds from the past. And that's what unforgiveness does. It keeps it alive. It keeps us tethered. It's sort of like being chained to the person who hurt you and dragging them through all the future. So forgiveness really is, of course, it's for the other person's benefit because they get to to get rid of their guilt and condemnation, and they get reconciliation possibly with us, get to have a future relationship. But also, you know what? It's for the forgiver because it helps you to forgive. One of the things we know from all sorts of research is to your health and your immune system and your outlook and all this stuff is affected by your ability to forgive. One of the ways I think about this, when we forgive, it's leaving things in the past and walking forward. Now think about this. Here's kind of a gross example, but I think there's a reason why when you metabolize food, what do you do when you metabolize food? Well, you take what's helpful through that process, whatever you ingested, and you take what's helpful and it becomes new cells, becomes new capacities within you. And what do you do with what's not helpful? You eliminate it, right? So think about this. When we go through experiences in life, sometimes even the most hurtful experiences, there's something in there we learn and we create wisdom and we know how to do something differently, how to avoid certain kinds of people, how to stand up for ourselves, whatever it is. That's the wisdom that comes sometimes through injury, and we take that forward. But the pain and all of that, you want to eliminate that and you want to leave it in the past. So think about this: when you walk through life, which side of your body is does the crap come out of? Well, it's behind me, right? Well, people that don't forgive, they're walking backwards into life and they're stepping in it. Because that it just keeps going. Now, I know that's a crude example, but it's a good one because that's what a lot of people do. Because of unforgiveness, they're dragging it forward. So I want you to be able to leave things behind, and I want you to see the value of this for the other person, but for yourself as well. It frees you. It lets go of that. There's a reason why companies on their balance sheet, there's a reason why a company will write off bad debt. Bad debt is debt that you can't collect on, right? And they want it off their balance sheet so it's not screwing up their finances. Well, if you've been hurt in the past, you're never going to collect that debt. I remember reading a transcript of a therapist one time where the therapist said to the patient, he said, "Okay, so if I understand this right, you're you're not going to you're not going to let go of this vengeance that you hold towards your mother until she treats you differently when you were 5 years old." Is that what I'm hearing you say? Think about that. That's kind of what it is. We can't undo what's happened, but we can let go of it. We can grieve it. We can forgive it. We can cancel the debt. I'm not going to be able to collect on that, and we can let it go. That's what forgiveness is. I like the biblical metaphor for this. It literally means to cancel a debt. Somebody owes you something. Somebody hurt you. They owe you. You know, justice says, you did me wrong and you should pay for that, right? Well, in the emotional, relational realm, how do you pay for that? How do you collect on that? And 99.9% of the time, they don't even want to pay anyway. There's no way we can enforce it. So to cancel the debt means we're done with it and we let it go and we start anew. Okay? So it's really, really important. And it's also very related to grief because forgiveness is a letting go. And when we let go of things, then we also have to process the pain. So here's what forgiveness is not: forgiveness is not denying that somebody did bad to you. Forgiveness requires that you name it and say, that was wrong. You hurt me. This is not good. That was unjust. That was horrible. And I have feelings about that. And I got anger and I got grief. And I go into therapy and I process this and I get all that pus out. But I've named it. You're not letting anybody off the hook because you're naming the hook. Then you're going to let them off the hook. So some people think to forgive is to deny. No, you've got to acknowledge that it was wrong. And that's a big part of the justice. So you acknowledge that it was wrong and you deal with the pain. And then you can let it go and say, you know what? I'm, I don't have a need to punish you. I don't have a need to extract vengeance from you. I forgive you. And what that does is it frees us. Now we can go forward if certain things happen. Remember, and I'm going to talk about this in a future segment, forgiveness doesn't mean that I automatically trust you again or I automatically reconcile with you. But what it does mean is I've let go of what happened to me, I've forgiven, and now that does a lot of good things, but a lot of good things have to do with my health. So it's very, very important to forgive. Hey guys, now for the second part of forgiveness. We talked about why it's so important. But here's a big confusion that you see in a lot of people. They're in something that's ongoing and they're trying to be forgiving, right? You got this relationship and they're just trying, this person is hurting them or not, whatever it is. They're trying to be forgiving and I got to be forgiving and I can't forgive and it's hard to forgive and I should be forgiving. Well, remember this, forgiveness has to do with the past, okay? If something's ongoing, it's not in the past. If you're getting abused today, it's very difficult to forgive something that's currently happening. And if we're going to forgive, that doesn't mean that forgiveness is putting up with ongoing abuse. There's actually one verse in the Bible, where they're asking Jesus about forgiveness. And they say, well, how serious are you about this forgiveness thing? Should we do it 7 times? He says, no, 70 times 70 times 70 is, the implication. No, you're always to be forgiving. But he adds something. He says, if the person comes to you and repents, then forgive them. In other words, what they've done is they've said there's an ending to it. I'm sorry I did this to you, right? And there's a timeline to this. Forgiveness has to do with something that's already happening. If you're currently being hurt or this is an ongoing problem, forgiveness is not the only question there, and it's not the immediate question. The immediate question is, let's stop this abuse. And so I can't forgive you until it's in the past. So I got to say, no more. So don't get forgiveness confused with the need for setting limits on something that's currently happening. Forgiveness has to do with, we've we've stopped the pain, and so now we can forgive what's in the past. If something's ongoing, we can talk about and think about forgiveness, and you want to be forgiving, you got to stop the pain. If that means calling the police or whatever it means to set the limits or other kind of boundaries we've talked about, that has to do with forgiveness. Hey guys, so let's talk about the next part of forgiveness. We talked about the need for it. We talked about how it's not, in the present. It has to do with something that's over. And now we're going to talk about this thing called trust, because a lot of people, they confuse forgiveness and trust. That if I forgive you, that means we just go forward, right? Like nothing ever happened. Well, not so much, because remember the time element I talked about? Forgiveness has to do with the past. Trust doesn't have to do with the past. Trust has to do with the future. Trust means I'm going to invest more in this relationship. I'm going to invest more with you. I've forgiven you. Let's move on. Well, do we know that it's okay to move on? Do we know that it's safe to move on? Let's say you get in a car with somebody that's drunk, right? And they hit a speed bump and banged your head up against the window or whatever. You know, okay, I got to be forgiving. Were you going to keep riding in the car with them? No, no. You can't trust them because they still got the issue. It's going to happen over and over and over again. So remember, here's the big phrase I like for people to think about. Forgiveness is free. It's something we grant to someone. Okay? Trust is earned. We trust people when there are reasons for us to trust them. There's a whole anatomy to trust. Do they understand what we need? Do they have the capacity to drive the car and not hurt me again? You know, do they care about wanting things to go well for me? Are they showing the character that I can really trust them, and all of that stuff? Are they building a track record where I can invest more and more? So don't think that just because you've forgiven somebody that means you got to open the door to the future. Well, you haven't forgiven me. Well, no, I have forgiven you, but I got to see some changes in your behavior before I continue to invest deeply in the relationship, as deeply as I was when I got hurt. You see this a lot of times, like in infidelity, and a lot of times, what somebody will want when they've been unfaithful to their spouse or partner or whatever, they 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 say, well, you should just let me back in and forgive me. What, you're not forget you're holding on to this. No, you're forgiven, but I still think you're a sex addict and you haven't gone and gotten help for that. You haven't changed some patterns that would prevent you from doing this again. So remember, for us to trust somebody in the future, that's a different issue than whether or not we're forgiving them for the past.
Moving forward, forgiveness key takeaways. People confuse forgiveness and trust. Remember the time element. Forgiveness has to do with the past. Trust has to do with the future. Do we know that it's okay to move on? Do we know that it's safe to move on? Say you get in the car with someone that's drunk. They hit a speed bump and you bang your head against the window. Are you going to forgive them and keep riding in the car with them? No. They're still drunk when you forgive someone. That doesn't mean that they can move forward without addressing the patterns that caused the problem.